Thank you everyone for being here. Let me ask you to set a little bit more of the context, because obviously the book was also prompted by the frustration that you saw among people who were looking at India, who were frustrated that India was not rising and shining fast enough. Corruption, profligacy, what have you. What made you think that India could be reimagined?
We thought that, in a sense, things were stuck in a rut in terms of how people were looking at India. There was mounting frustration about India's potential and whether it would ever reach there. On the other hand, we also saw that there were underlying strengths and the opportunities were fantastic. And when you look at the development of a country and you look at the development of improving the lives of 1 billion people, forget about the GDP, but improving the lives of 1 billion plus people, the potential was still there. And that, developing that kind of potential takes time. You can't just do that in a quarter, in a year, in a 5-year period. But over a 10, 15-year period, you can actually change many things. I think it's a very realistic portrait, and 65 people have different views on it. Some are very pessimistic, some are very optimistic, but all have ideas on how we can accelerate to get to that potential.
The book says unlocking the potential of Asia's next superpower. How would you define a superpower, or what would you desire India to grow into?
Very recently, we had an exercise to redefine the core purpose of our group. And I was astonished to find that when we co-created it with our people, I thought they would say something like, we want to be a $50 billion corporation by 2020, or we want to be the largest company in the world, or something like that. And they came out saying, we want to be the most admired, one of the most admired brands in the world. And so when I was talking about this essay, I thought to myself, what if you said, we want to be one of the most admired and respected countries in the world? Very simple, and you say, what the hell does that mean? It means nothing. But when you start distilling that down and letting it dictate the actions, policy actions of a government, it's astonishing how specific it can get. It goes into your economics. You will have to have growth with inclusion if you want to be admired. I think India has a chance to create a completely new template for what a country should be. And that's where I think I started in my essay about why do you look at economics differently. And I won't go into that anymore. I'll end here. But to me, this was the exciting part of this exercise. And real opportunity to reimagine the core purpose of this country.
Mr. Ambani, I think, just taking off from there, because he says you've got to have growth with inclusion. You write about meeting the aspirations of the 700 to 800 million people who remain on the fringes of India's success story. How patient will those people be? Because while we talk about we have 10 years, they have 20 years, they have 30 years, how patient will those 700, 800 million people be? Because they've been remarkably patient so far. So are we running out of time?
My sense is that they're already impatient. Right? The aspirations of our youth is phenomenal today. And the youth is India's strength. So if you think about all the noise in our system, to my mind, it's really making us more aware of their aspirations, of their expectations, and of our collective ability to meet the aspirations of them. And I think that it is really the youth. India is a young country, and it is the youth that is going to drive. And continuing from what Anand said, right? When we think about reimagination is not doing more of the same. It's trying to find a new way, a way that when I grew up, when I was 20 or 30 years old, like the same issues existed, but we were a lot more tolerant. Today, right, the youth will demand results out of society as a whole. I am one who generally believes that it is not government's jobs to do everything, right? For a reimagined India to move on, we need a coalition of everybody in society. We need to have a positive mindset, and positivity, right, is very important.
Vishakha, the same question I asked Anand. How would you define superpower, especially in the context that in your essay you talk about, you're slightly dismayed that the present debate and discourse is tilted towards economic and material welfare and not so much cultural.
One of the things we mustn't forget is that often we are focused on what I would call 66, and almost 26. What do I mean by that? India became a nation in 47, and India became an economic power, if you will, or a player, barely 26 years old. Culturally, our identity goes back 6,000 years. And yet, when we think about reimagining this new place that we're in, we almost forget that we actually have a tremendous wealth of knowledge and information. And yet, when it comes to humanities and culture, look at the condition of who is studying that. There's lots of people who go into liberal arts, and yet the death of liberal arts in this country is, I think, rather pathetic. That is where I think we have to really focus on for the 21st century.
Another myth or not, Suhel, the price of democracy. Every time, we almost say it with pride. When things don't go well, we say, this is the price of democracy. We're almost proud about it.
We have become evangelists for reimagining India's economy. We need to reimagine India, the nation state. We don't have a sense of nationalism in this country. And I'm telling you, take this point seriously. Nationalism doesn't sow its seeds overnight. It's not an ATM or, instant coffee. That has to be done through a cultural overhauling, which is also required. The fact that most of us, don't even know which are the 7 states in the Northeast. The fact that we are so disengaged, even from the icons that have actually shaped India's history.
So I want to just pick up on one point that Suhel mentioned. This has to do with the issue of democracy. And there's a wonderful essay by a professor called Yasheng Huang, who's a professor of economics at MIT. And I think it would be a wonderful thing for many of you if you get a chance to read his work. But he's written one essay that summarizes it, and so I'll just tell you in 30 seconds. He says he's done work on this issue of the link between growth of an economy, economic growth, and the system of government, autocracy or democracy. And he's been doing that for the last 20, 25 years and has published a lot of results on that. And at the end of all of that work, he says there is no statistical link between growth of an economy and the system of government. There are foolish democracies, there are good democracies. There are foolish autocracies, there are good autocracies. There are successful autocracies, there are, horrible autocracies that have destroyed countries, and there are successful democracies and not so successful.
On the point, Anand, have you ever wished that at some point you were working running an enterprise in an autocracy where decisions could be made quicker?
Now the provocation begins. I want to just link up something Suhel said to what Adil was saying. He talked about the idea of India, which immediately brought to mind Sunil Khilnani's amazing book, where he first started raising these questions about what is our idea of India. And there was a terrific New York Times review of his book, which was largely positive. But they said what Sunil missed out on was the groundswell of bottom-up change that was happening in India. He accorded the nation state, or the government, the highest power, and analyzed that to death and about what its role was. But here again, Adil, before we get so absorbed about government, I think what's happening in India is really unique. And we haven't recognized it up to now. The New York Times guy had a wonderful sentence, I don't remember the whole thing verbatim. But what he says is that although the state and the government has widespread power, it really doesn't have the ability and the resources to make the change happen, to enforce the legislation change. It's only when people, simple people, working to help each other, when they come together to make their lives better, that things change. And that is happening in India. It's happening because finally we're getting a critical mass of all these NGOs who've been working over time.
Yep.
Companies have been supporting them. I'm not that worried about the system of government anymore. I know from my own experience, again, I have to quote from my firm, that the one thing that works in managing complex entities is extreme empowerment. And that's what's happening in India. It's too complex a country to work in any other fashion. So I'm very, very optimistic about change. It's going to come from the bottom.
And you are too, because you were saying that
absolutely. I think that we are at the cusp of time where every one of our 1.1 billion Indians will be empowered, will have a voice.
The 800 left out and the 400.
Everyone, right? And we will see them participating And it is important that we recognize that each and every Indian counts. And getting that kind of a process, right? And I have said this many times that in this mindset, if we have this collective mindset, then India is this 1.1 billion opportunities and not 1.1 billion problems or negative thinking.
As India grows more confident, are you seeing that we are willing to look out and pick up best practices from outside?
It's a cliche now. When we go out and we have to talk to investors who are bemoaning the state of India, I say, look, you have to look at India as the United States of India. This is not one monolithic India. You've got UP, which is larger than most countries in the world. If any state has an enlightened government, by all means go there. And I do not believe we don't learn. I think we haven't had an open country to see what change there is. But states are competing. They're very clearly competing with each other. Going back to our tradition, kya kehte hain isko? Jamun. How does your mother make dahi, by the way?
Well, I haven't seen her do it in a long time. We just take processed dahi nowadays. Must be Danone. Is there anyone from Danone who can then give me a free supply?
I have to urge you to go back to your Indianness, Suhel. Use jamun.
Urge my mother. Urge my mother.
So,
I know it's too shade.
My mother used to make it by putting a jamun. Jamun, I don't know what the word is, a catalyst maybe? You call it a catalyst? Yeah. Jamun is a catalyst. So you put the yesterday's dahi in today's milk, that changes the milk. India is like that. So
I thought it was called bacteria.
We don't go there just yet. So I really think we are waiting for jamuns. And if that reimagining India is about 65 jamuns, so be it. But we need a leader who's going to be a jamun. And whoever is a jamun is going to win next time's election.
On that note, I'm just going to go to the audience. We got some people sent in questions. I think Leo Puri, Managing Director, UT Asset Management. Leo, you got a question. So,
there is a perspective on Indian democracy, which is that we are actually using the democratic process and democratic institutions to settle century-old scores. And these are feuds across caste, community, feudal injustice, and so on. And what you're seeing played out at this point is frankly just the use of those instruments of state to settle these scores. Now, if that perspective has any merit, is it really realistic to expect room for nationalism, good governance, or are these frankly just elitist fantasies? And should we just be celebrating the fact that despite that, even as we diffuse these old time bombs, we are still able to live in relative freedom and with the relative security that we have?
To me, one of the things that's so remarkable about India is that it is still an experiment. Nobody ever did what India has done, which is that in 47, when we got the independence, we were a poor country and democratic. Nobody ever had done that before. What America took more than 150 years, we try to do it like that. And as a result, I think we have to remember that this is still an evolving thing. Even democratic experiment that we have is maturing as different things are coming in.
I had a hard time with the question itself. So just to put on record, right, that I couldn't relate to the question at all. But one thing I am very sure about is that I'm a very, very proud Indian.
Yep.
And whatever, the very fact that we can discuss India so openly itself is a privilege. And yes, and for me, I would not trade my Indianism for anything else in the world.
we got a question from a student here, Deepika Padmanabhan, student at St. Xavier's.
Since the panel spoke about the ability to earn from the economy today and the importance of education, India has always favored higher education over job experience. So considering the current job market and its requirement, do you think the youth should continue to do so?
We are awash in this country with what I call false dichotomies again. Why do we have to say you will only do higher education and no job experience? The brilliance of the American society is that ever since a child gets into middle school, they're getting work experience while being educated. And after a point, it becomes so seamless, your experience and your education, that they become a new thing altogether, a much more powerful thing. What we do, I think, wrongly is that when we are going through high school, our obsession with grades and our obsession with the way in which we evaluate students prevents them from getting any spare time to go out and gain experience. I think we have to rectify that. And all throughout our educational system, barring child labor, of course, when they get into an age of doing some decent summer job, I think we need to encourage people to go out and get work experience simultaneously. That has to go out and drop again this dichotomy of either or.
We have another question this time. Richard Bale, the Consul General for Canada and India.
I'm a newcomer here, and I'm an outsider, so if you'll bear with me, I will ask an outsider's question. As a newcomer, one of the things that actually has surprised me about Indian society is the relatively low participation of women in the labor force. The panel covered a whole range of issues, but you did not touch on gender. And I'm curious about that. When you look at the World Bank doing business rankings, for example, where India doesn't score very well, one of the rankings that really drags it down is that female participation in the labor force element. There's indications, surprisingly to an outsider, that as India becomes wealthier, that participation in the labor force actually falls, which is the opposite to what somebody like I would expect. So my question is to the panel, first, is that something that you think needs reimagining? And if so, how do you reimagine it? Thank you.
I think we haven't given the fair share of impetus as well as recognition to women in general. If you look at the corporate world, women are very poorly represented on corporate boards. It is shocking that most corporate boards don't have as many women as there should be. The base has to be education. If you don't respect the woman that is your mother or is your sister, whatever happens later will be just, lip service.
So reimagining India for gender equality, the answer is education. That's your...
I would say education, as Mukesh and Anand also touched upon it, I would say not the current form of education, but tweak it to make it relevant and relatable.
Being the only woman on the panel, I think I should answer that question as well. But let me just say that recently Delhi Policy Studies just came out with a report. It's a gender scorecard, state by state. And one of the overall conclusions that is rather disturbing is that the male-female gender ratio is worse today in India than it was in 1947.
Yep.
That has to do with what Amartya Sen calls millions of young children, girls, that are not even born. That is not just about education, it's also about attitude. And in this country, if we don't change the attitude along with education, that issue will remain.
In the past 3 years, we've tanked the economy. We've made young people believe they've got to leave this country. Students are not coming back. It's a terrible situation that's been created in 3 years by one government. And here you are cheerfully talking about how wonderful things are. Can you just explain to me why?
If you look at the development of any country over a period of time, and any society over a period of time, you go through ups and downs in the economy, you go through ups and downs in policy decisions, you have different governments over periods of time. So I don't think anyone's arguing that the last 3 years have not been what any of us would have liked in terms of the economy, in terms often of policies, etc. But you can't give up on a country because of 3 years. We have to keep trying to improve it, and if the underlying basis is pretty good, then you at least have to try to change some of the things that have occurred and make it reach its potential. If you're trying to make something reach its potential and you would like to call it foolish optimism, hey, I'm a foolish optimist. But I would like the country to improve, and the fact that we had 5 years when it grew like crazy, at that time, perhaps we were a little too optimistic, but we didn't then say there's nothing wrong with the country because it's growing so well. Right? So I think we have to, as the book argues, as many of the essays argue in the book, this is a long-term development of a country. In the process of the long-term development, we will go through cycles when horrible things happen. Right? We should be much better than what we are. I don't think the book glosses over, or our columnists gloss over, our essays gloss over the many problems of education, of women, of governance, of infrastructure, of healthcare. It says those are things that we have to solve, and we cannot give up on it because we are affecting the lives of 1.2 billion people. So our optimism, I think, I should speak for any of the other panelists. I'm only speaking for me over here. Our optimism is as we look at the potential and the fact that other countries have made mistakes and recovered, and that if we could mess up things in 3 years, perhaps we can improve them in 3 years also. Right? We messed up things for many years, you could argue, when our growth rate was much slower, and yet in the space of 10 years or 20 years, it made a big difference.
So with that, I'll wind this up. And yes, this was a wide-ranging book of 65 articles. We could barely touch on 4 or 5 of the issues that we were required to cover. So I'm sure some of you are disappointed, but I think it's comprehensive. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Vishakha, thank you so much for joining us.